In the cold silence between stars, something ancient stirred. A vast vessel, dark as the void itself, drifted through the outer reaches of the Cygnus Arm. It had no name in any human language. Its crew called themselves the Valthari. The observers, the architects of consequence. They had watched 10,000 civilizations rise, stumble, and dissolve into cosmic dust. They had catalogued the final screams of empires that once touched the edge of forever. They believed they had seen everything the universe could offer in terms of sentient life. They were wrong. The Valthari had been monitoring a small, unremarkable blue planet for precisely 412 of its orbital cycles. In that time, they had watched it fracture, bleed, rebuild, fracture again, and somehow still breathe. The species was classified under catalog entry 77 Zeta, Homo sapiens. Tertiary variant, it was a species that should not have survived its own adolescence. Every model they ran ended in extinction by the 3rd century of industrialization. Every simulation showed collapse, resource depletion, atmospheric destabilization, tribal warfare escalating to mutual annihilation. And yet, the planet spun. The species endured. Head researcher Salvath pressed 6 of her limbs together in the gesture that denoted profound confusion. She reviewed the data for the 47th time that cycle. They should be gone, she said quietly to her senior analyst Dravis. And yet, they persist, Dravis replied, his bioluminescent markings pulsing with unease. Not just persist, Salvath corrected. They have unified. The word landed in the observation deck like a dropped star. Unified was not a word the Valthari used lightly. Of the 10,000 civilizations they had catalogued, fewer than 30 had achieved lasting unified governance. Of those 30, only 11 had done so without total cultural erasure of minority factions. The humans had done something different entirely. They had not unified through conquest. They had not unified through fear. They had unified through something the Valtharis sociological models had no adequate term for. The closest translation was shared memory of shared suffering, voluntarily carried forward. We must understand this. Salvat said, understanding from a distance is no longer sufficient. Dravis agreed. Then we will bring them to us. If you are finding this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about what humans are truly made of. The abduction was clinical, bloodless, and precise. 17 humans were selected across a broad range of genetic heritage, geographic origin, occupational background, and age. A retired civil engineer from a coastal megacity. A teenage girl who had grown up in the restored forests of what was once called Siberia. A grandmother who remembered the last of the old nation-states. A child born on the orbital habitat ring, who had never once stood on the surface of Earth. A soldier who had not fired a weapon in anger for 40 years, because there had been no wars left to fight. A composer, a mathematician, a farmer, a physician, a monk, a shipwright, and hoters, and orders. They were placed in a controlled habitat aboard the Valthari vessel. A space designed to sustain human biology precisely, engineered to resemble a generalized Earth environment. Salvath watched them through instruments that could measure everything from cortisol levels to micro-expressions of social bonding. She expected fear. She expected aggression. She expected the tribal fracturing her models predicted. What she got was something else entirely. Within 6 minutes of awakening in the habitat, the humans had formed a circle. They had not been instructed to do this. They did not share a language from before the Great Convergence. Several of them spoke only regional dialects. And yet, they formed a circle. The retired engineer, a broad-shouldered man named Caro, held out his hand to the teenage girl beside him. She took it without hesitation. Within 12 minutes, all 17 humans were holding hands in a circle. Salvath's instruments detected a synchronization in their breathing patterns. She checked the instruments twice, then a third time. They were breathing together, not because they were told to, not because they were afraid, because something in them reached instinctively for collective rhythm in the face of the unknown. What are they doing? Asked junior analyst Veeth, who was observing for the first time. They are becoming, Salvath said softly, and could not explain further. The Valthari began their experiments the following cycle. The tests were not cruel by their standards. They were designed to measure limits: stress, tolerance, problem-solving under deprivation. Social cohesion under external pressure. Individual sacrifice, calculus. They introduced a food scarcity scenario, enough sustenance for 12 of the 17, distributed in a way that forced competition. The humans looked at the food. They looked at each other. The grandmother, a woman named Essid, who carried 83 years on a frame that had clearly survived more than most, immediately began dividing the food into 17 equal portions. "That's not enough for anyone," muttered the mathematician. A young man named Yule, watching her hands. "No," Essa agreed, "but it is equal. An equal can be endured. Unequal cannot." She said it with the certainty of someone who had read it, not in a book, but in the lines of history. They shared the food. All 17 ate. None complained. Salvath increased the deprivation. 3 cycles without adequate food. The humans grew quieter, more efficient with their movement, more deliberate with their words. They did not turn on each other. On to contrary, the soldier, whose name was Marin, began leading quiet morning exercises that she said would preserve muscle function and mental clarity. The physician, Dr. Ase, began monitoring everyone's health with nothing more than his hands and his trained eyes. The child from the orbital ring, Little Pox, who was 8 years old and had the philosophical calmness of someone raised between the stars, would sit with whoever looked most troubled and simply be present with them. No words, just presence. Salvath found herself watching Pox more than any other subject. "The child is applying a therapeutic protocol," Travis observed. "The child was never trained in one," Salvath replied. "Then how?" She did not answer. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this exist to remind us what we are capable of. Share this with someone today. On the 6th cycle, the Valthari introduced the isolation test. 1 human was separated from the group at a time, placed in a sensory-induced chamber, and observed. The models predicted significant psychological deterioration within 24 hours of isolation. The first subject isolated was Caro, the engineer. He sat in the empty white chamber for 11 hours without visible distress. Then he began to build. He had nothing to build with. He used the seams of his clothing, the pressure of his fingers against the floor, the rhythm of his own breath. He built patterns. Geometric forms scratched faintly into the soft floor material of the chamber. He was designing something, a bridge. Salvat realized eventually he was designing a bridge from memory, working out load-bearing calculations with no tools whatsoever. When they returned him to the group after 20 hours, the first thing he did was describe the bridge to the others, not as a complaint, not as a way of expressing how difficult the isolation had been. He described it as a gift, as if the isolation had given him time to create something he wanted to share. The monk, a quiet woman named Sella, closed her eyes when he finished describing it, and said simply, "It sounds beautiful." And Caro's eyes filled with something the Valthari instruments registered as a complex emotional compound they had no precise name for. The second isolated subject was Yule, the mathematician. He lasted 30 hours before he began speaking aloud, not to the walls, not in distress. He began lecturing. He stood up in the empty chamber and began teaching a class that no one was attending, walking through the history of prime number theory with the passion of someone addressing an auditorium. When he was returned to the group, he immediately asked if anyone wanted to learn something interesting about the relationship between infinity and patterns. 3 people immediately said yes. By the time they had been in captivity for 14 cycles, the Valthari research team was holding emergency internal sessions that were decidedly less clinical than their usual proceedings. "Their social bonds are strengthening under pressure," Dravis said, reviewing data with 6 arms, moving simultaneously through holographic displays. "That is the opposite of the predicted model," said Veeth. "Yes," said Sal. "How is it possible?" Veeth Preste. Salvath was quiet for a long moment. "We have been studying the wrong variable," she finally said. "Explain," Travis said. "We have been measuring their resilience, as if it is a property of the individual," she said. We assumed resilience was distributed, that some would be strong, some would collapse, and the group average would determine survival probability. That is the standard model. It is wrong, Salvath said. For these humans, resilience is not a property of the individual. She paused, looking at the visual feed from the habitat, where the 17 humans were currently gathered around Issa, as she told a story from her childhood. Something about a flooding river in a village that rebuilt itself 3 times. It is a property of the group, Salvath finished, and the group becomes more resilient the more it is stressed, not less. Silence fell over the research deck. That is not supposed to be possible, Veith said quietly. No, Salvath agreed. It is not. If this story is speaking to something in you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a video. Share it. Because some stories deserve to travel. It was on the 19th cycle that the Valthari made their first mistake. They decided to test the humans' response to genuine loss. The physician, Dr. Osei, collapsed during his morning rounds of the group. It was not staged. The Valthari had underestimated the cumulative effect of dietary restriction on a man of his age. He fell, and he did not rise. Moraine reached him first. She was trained in emergency medicine from her military years, and her hands moved with the automatic authority of someone who had kept people alive in conditions that would have been impossible on paper. She worked on him for 22 minutes with nothing but her hands and her knowledge and her will. She did not succeed. Dr. Asay died on the 19th cycle, 3,400 light-years from the planet where he had been born. What happened next, the Valthari would discuss for decades. The grief that moved through those 16 humans was not the collapse their models predicted. It was not quiet, either. It was large and loud, and it filled the habitat like a tide. They wept. Several of them wept loudly, without restraint, as if the restraint itself would have been a dishonor. The child, Pox, sat in the center of them and wept with an 8-year-old's uncomplicated honesty. And somehow that small sound held all the others together like an axis. They spoke of Dr. Asay for hours, not about his death, about his life, about what he had done in the 14 cycles they had known him, the way he hummed while checking on each of them, the way he always had a name for whatever was hurting, the way he called the grandmother elder with a tone that turned the word into a crown. They were building something with their words. They were building a monument. Salvath watched and said nothing for a very long time. Tense Said. They are preserving him. He is dead, Dravis said, not unkindly. Yes, Salvath said, and they are making sure he does not disappear. She watched as Caro began etching something into the wall of the habitat. The name of the physician, surrounded by the geometric shapes of his bridge design. They are the only species in our catalogue, she said slowly, that turns grief into architecture. The test that followed Dr. Osei's death was not intentional. The Valthari reduced the habitat's light cycle, mimicking the psychological pressure of prolonged winter, a tactic their models showed reliably induced despair and social breakdown in most sentient species. The humans did not break. They started singing. It began with Essa, who hummed something low and ancient, in a language that only she among them fully spoke. Witin and Or. All 16 were participating, some humming, some learning the melody by ear, some providing a quiet rhythmic percussion with their hands against the floor. The composer, a tall, angular woman named Rin, began weaving counter-melodies around S's theme. The Monksella added harmonics so pure that Dravis's instruments registered a measurable change in the atmospheric composition of the habitat. The humans were producing something, through sound, that altered their shared environment. What are they doing? Veith whispered. Surviving, Salvath said. And her tone had changed. It was no longer the tone of a researcher observing subjects. It was the tone of a witness. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Like this video if the story is moving you. Share it with everyone you think should hear it. It was on the 31st cycle that Salvath broke Valthari protocol for the first time in her 400-year career. She entered the habitat. She appeared to the humans in her true form, a form that should, by every biological and psychological model they possessed, have triggered a fear response. She stood 7 feet tall. She had 6 limbs. Her skin was a shifting mosaic of bioluminescent patterns. She had no face in any human sense, no eyes, no mouth, only sensory organs, distributed across her upper body like constellations. She stood in the entrance of the habitat. The humans looked at her. They did not run. They did not attack. They did not freeze in the paralyzed terror her models predicted. They looked at her. And then Karo stood up, walked across the habitat, and held out his hand. Salvath had 6 limbs, and no protocols for what he was doing. She extended the limb that most resembled an arm. He shook it. "You've been watching us," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Salvath, through the translation matrix embedded in the habitat systems. "You took us from our home." "Yes." "You want to understand us." "Yes." Karo nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who had suspected as much for 31 cycles, and had simply been waiting for confirmation. "Then ask," he said. "We'll answer what we can." Salvath experienced something she had no name for. Later, she would describe it to Dravis as a structural reconfiguration of her core assumptions. Dravis would recognize this, after a long moment, as the Valtheri equivalent of being humbled. She asked them everything. She asked about the Great Convergence, the 1,100-year process by which humanity had moved from 7 billion fragmented individuals in 200 competing nation-states to a single unified civilization of 14 billion. She expected to hear about a war that ended all wars, a catastrophe so total it forced unification as a survival mechanism. What she heard instead was longer, stranger, and more difficult. It was never one thing, Essa said. She was sitting in the way she always sat, with perfect stillness, as if she had made a personal peace with time itself. The floods came, the fires came, the plagues came, the wars almost came several times. We were right at the edge. Then what stopped the wars? Salvath asked. The children, Essa said simply. Every generation, the children remembered what the last generation had suffered, and they decided they would not do it again. But that is not how it works, Salvath said, with genuine bewilderment. In every species we have studied, collective memory of trauma produces more tribalism, not less. Groups close inward. They defend against the perceived cause of suffering. Yes, Essa agreed. That is what the fear does, but we also had something else. What? Essa was quiet for a moment, as if choosing the words with great care. We had people who stood up in the middle of the fear and said, "This is what we went through. All of us. Not your group. Not their group. All of us. C'est paus. C'est paus." And they said it over and over and over. 4 generations. In every language, in every form. In songs, and books, and buildings, and laws, and the names they gave to their children. Until it became true, Karo added quietly. Salvath processed this. You created a shared identity from shared suffering, she said. We decided to, the mathematician. You all said, leaning forward with the intensity he brought to everything he cared about. That's the part most people get wrong when they look at us from the outside. Explain, Salvath said. It wasn't inevitable, Yule said. It wasn't what humans do naturally. Naturally, we're tribal as hell. Pardon the expression. We are wired for small groups and clear enemies. Then how choice? Said Marion. The soldier, she said it the way she said most things, with the directness of someone who had spent decades in service to a principle larger than herself. Choice. Every single generation chose it again. The convergence didn't happen because humanity became better. It happened because enough humans, in every generation, chose to be better than their fear. Silence. Silence. Salvath's bioluminescent markings had gone still in a way that Dravis, watching from the observation deck, recognized as deep cognitive processing. Over 1,100 years, she said at last. Generation after generation. Choosing, Marion confirmed. If this story is reaching you, if it is reminding you of what you are, what we all are, please like this video, subscribe, and share it. These stories matter. Help them travel. Salvath spent 12 cycles in habitat with the humans after that. She learned things that could not be measured with any instrument the Valthari possessed. She learned that the child Pox had been born on the orbital ring precisely because her parents wanted her to see Earth as a whole, from above, before she ever walked on it. We wanted her to understand it as a single thing before she learned its parts. Pux's mother had told the child. The mother was not there. She was 3,400 light-years away. But Pux said it as if she was quoting something she would carry forever. Salvath learned that the composer Rin had lost her entire home city in the coastal flooding of 2187. A full century before Rin was born, but had grown up in a culture that spoke of that flooding as a shared wound, not a historical footnote. "We have a word," Rin said. "We brought it from one of the old languages. It means grief that belongs to all of us. Grief we carry together because no one should carry it alone." "What is the word?" Salvath asked. Rin said it in the old language. Salvath recorded it carefully. She learned that the monk Sela had taken her vows not to any god in particular. The tradition she followed had evolved over the long centuries of the convergence into something that was less about devotion to a deity and more about devotion to presence. "We practice being here," Sela said, "fully, with whoever is beside us. That is the whole of it." She learned that Karo's bridge designs, the ones he had scratched into the isolation chamber floor, were not original. They were reconstructions of bridges that had been destroyed in wars 200 years before he was born. "My grandmother's grandmother remembered them," he said. "She described them to her children. They described them to theirs. I learned to draw them before I learned to ride a bicycle." "What?" Salvath asked. "Why preserve the design of a destroyed bridge?" Carol looked at her with an expression that she had come to recognize as the human face of a question that answers itself. "Because the bridge wasn't just a bridge," he said. "It was proof that we could build something that beautiful, and if we could build it once, we could build it again." Pause. "We have always built again," he said. Salvath left the habitat on the 44th cycle, returned to the research deck, and sealed herself in her analysis chamber. She stayed there for 6 cycles without contact. When she emerged, she called a full assembly of the research team. There were 37 Valthari researchers present. Every one of them had been watching the same feeds. Every one of them had, in their own way, been reconfigured. Salvath stood before them and said, "We have made an error in the experiment." Asked a junior researcher named Thal. "In our fundamental frame of reference," Salvath said, "she let that land. We came to study resilience," she continued. "We designed tests to measure it, quantify it, understand its upper limits. We asked, how much can this species endure? And we have our answer," Drevis said carefully. "No," Salvath said. "We have discovered that the question is wrong." She brought up the data from 44 cycles on the central display. The graphs, the measurements, the behavioral logs. "The correct question is not, how much can they endure? The correct question is, what do they build with what they endure?" She let the silence hold for a moment. "Every civilization we have studied treats suffering as something to be survived. A cost. A subtraction from what they were before. That is universal," said Thal. "It was universal," Salvath corrected. "These humans have spent 1,100 years learning to make it something else." "What do they make it?" someone asked from the back. Salvath's bioluminescent patterns shifted into the configuration that meant, "I am about to say something I believe to be true and do not yet have a name for." "Material," she said. "They make it material. They take what has broken them and they build with it. They build memory. They build culture. They build identity. They build each other." She paused. "They are not resilient because they are strong. They are resilient because they have learned over 11 centuries of practice to transform suffering into construction material." The room was very quiet. "And they do it together," she added. "Always together." The individual human is fragile, biologically, psychologically. They are among the most vulnerable, complex organisms we have ever catalogued. But the human collective, under stress, does not fracture along individual fault lines. She searched for the word. "It crystallizes," she finished. "The pressure causes crystallization. They become more ordered, more purposeful, more unified." the harder the force applied. Thal stared at the data for a long moment. "That is not how matter works," he said finally. "No," Salvath agreed. "It is not how matter works, it is how they work. If you are watching this and feeling something stir inside you, that is the truth of who we are. Like this video, subscribe, share it with someone who has forgotten their own strength." On the 47th cycle, Salvath returned to the habitat and told the humans that they would be returned to Earth. They received this news with characteristic human complexity: relief, grief, practical questions. A brief collective moment of silence for Dr. Assay, who would be making no such journey. Caro asked if they could bring his body home. Salvath had not considered this. She considered it now. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," Caro said, with a gravity that made it clear this was not a courtesy. It was a recognition of something fundamental. As the preparations for return were made, Salvath sat one last time with Essa. The grandmother moved slowly now. The weeks of deprivation had cost her something, though she had never let it show. Salvath asked her the question she had been forming for 30 cycles. "In all the suffering your species has endured, in all the floods and plagues and in all the grief you carry forward in your collective memory, has there ever been a moment when you considered stopping?" Issa looked at her steadily. "Stopping what?" "Continuing," Salvath said. "Choosing, again, to go on, to rebuild, to trust the next generation to carry what you carry." Essa was quiet for a long time. Then sighed. "Every generation has had that moment. Every single one. And every single one chose to pass it forward, instead of letting it end." "Why?" Salvath asked. "After everything? Why?" Issa smiled. It was the smile of someone who has held the answer to this question for 83 years, and has finally asked it by someone who genuinely doesn't know. "Because of who comes after," she said simply. "Every generation looks at the children and thinks, they deserve to see what this becomes. They deserve to stand in the world we make from what broke us." She paused. "And that is enough. That has always been enough." The return journey took 11 days. During those 11 days, Salvath filed the longest research report in Velthari history. It was not a clinical document. It began with data. Thousands of pages of it, meticulous and precise. But it ended with something that had never appeared in a Velthari research document before. It ended with a question, not a research question. "A philosophical one," she wrote. "In 10,000 civilizations, we have catalogued the patterns of survival. We have measured the thresholds of endurance. We have documented the architectures of collapse. We have never before encountered a species that treats its own history of suffering as a living resource. A species that does not merely survive what breaks it, but incorporates the breaking into what it becomes." She wrote, "We came to study their limits. We found instead that they have, over the course of 11 centuries, systematically abolished the concept of a final limit, not through strength, not through immunity, through the deliberate, chosen, generationally renewed decision to carry each other." She wrote, "I do not know what to do with this." And then, after a pause in the record where her writing instruments went still for several minutes, she wrote, "I know that I will not forget it." When the humans were returned to Earth, to a designated landing site outside the city of Caro's birth, at dawn on a clear morning, there was a delegation waiting. Word had gotten out, as it always did among a unified humanity, with 1,000 years of practice at sharing information quickly and calmly. The delegation was not military. It was not governmental. Exactly. It was families. The families of the 17. And behind the families, at a respectful distance, the quiet presence of a watching world. Because, in a unified civilization of 14 billion, things like this did not stay private long, and no one had wanted them to. Pax ran first, 8 years old, raised between the stars. Never once in her life having lived through what her parents' generation had endured, or their parents. Parents had rebuilt, and yet somehow carrying all of it in her small frame with a weight and a lightness simultaneously. She ran to her mother and father and disappeared into their arms. Salvath watched from the ship's observation ports as the reunions happened below. She watched Caro embrace a woman she calculated was his daughter, and saw the daughter's hand press flat against her father's back in the particular way that meant, "I am checking that you are real." She watched Marin stand apart for a moment before a young man, perhaps her son, simply walked to her and stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction, not speaking, just together. She watched Essa, moving slowly on the landing field, walk toward an enormous extended family that had arranged itself, not in a crowd, but in a kind of formation, as if they had rehearsed it, as if they understood without discussion that she needed to see them as a whole before she could deal with any single one of them. And she watched Rin, the composer, stand alone for a moment on the landing field. No family visible, no one running toward her. But then the monk Sela, who had her own family waiting, turned back and came to stand with Rin first. Just for a moment, just to make sure she was not standing alone in the moment of return. Rin looked at her. Sela said nothing. Rin nodded. No, and something passed between them that Salvat's instruments could not measure and did not need to. If this story has meant something to you today, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. You are part of what keeps these stories alive. Thank you. The Valthari report was released to their broader civilization 11 cycles after the return. It caused, to use a word that is approximate, but not inaccurate, a sensation. The Valthari were not easily surprised. They had observed 10,000 civilizations and believed themselves, not unreasonably, to be comprehensive in their understanding of how sentient life worked. The report broke something open in that belief, not because it said humanity was perfect. The report was meticulously honest about every failure, every near-collapse, every generation that had come close to choosing extinction over effort. It broke something open because it documented, in thousand-year longitudinal detail, what it looked like when a species chose. When a species, every generation, stood at the same crossroads their ancestors had stood at, the crossroads between closing inward and opening outward, between holding suffering and sharing it, between protecting the in-group and expanding the definition of who counted as home and chose, again, the harder, larger thing. 11 centuries, 1,000 years of the same choice, made new each time. Never guaranteed, never automatic, never safe. Always chosen. The report ended with Salvath's philosophical question. Her, I do not know what to do with this. Her, I know that I will not forget it. Other Valtari, reading it, found themselves writing similar things in their own private records. I do not know what to do with this. I know that I will not forget it. It was the beginning of something. Years later, many years, the kind of years that accumulate slowly into decades and then into the weight of a century. There was a memorial on Earth. It was not a grand structure. Humans had built grand structures and knew their place. This was simpler. It was a garden, planted in the restored forest that had once been called the Sahara, before the regreening projects of the 23rd century had made it a living thing. Again, in the garden there was a grove. In the grove there were 17 trees, one for each of the people who had been taken. 16 living, one with a small plaque at its roots that read the name of the physician who had not come home, and the words, "He cared for us in the dark. We carry him into the light." The trees were not native to the same region. They had been brought from 17 different corners of the earth, one for each person's place of origin, and they had been planted together, close enough that their roots would eventually meet underground. That was intentional. Children came to the grove on school visits. They were told the story, not just the story of the 17, the larger story. The 1,100-year story of how humanity had learned, slowly and imperfectly and never completely, but always forward, to make its suffering into something it could give each other. The children listened with the specific quality of attention that children give to things they sense are true in a way they can't yet articulate. And then they would run between the trees, and their laughter, that uncomplicated, uninstructed, freely given sound would fill the grove and drift out into the regreened forests that had once been desert, and carry on the wind past the place where the Sahara used to end, out into the world that humanity had built from everything that had tried to break it. Salvath, in her vessel, far from that garden, never heard that laughter, but she would have recognized it. She had instruments that could measure everything. She had observed 10,000 civilizations. She knew, the way you know something you cannot prove but cannot doubt, that the sound children make when they run free through a world their ancestors refused to abandon is one of the most extraordinary sounds in the universe. And somewhere in the cold mathematics of her 400-year career, a small and unnamed reconfiguration had occurred. She no longer thought of herself as only an observer. She thought of herself as something she had never been trained to be. She thought of herself as changed. The universe is very large. It is very old. It has seen the birth and death of more stars than there are grains of sand on every beach of every world. In all of it, across all the civilizations that have risen and fallen like tides, across all the languages and forms and methods of life, in all of it very few things are genuinely surprising. But there is this, a small planet, third from an ordinary star, in the outer spiral of an unremarkable galaxy, a species that should not have survived. That survived, not because it was the strongest, not because it was the fastest or the most intelligent or the most technologically advanced or the least prone to catastrophic error, but because, when everything was at its darkest, when the floods came and the fires came and the rifts opened, and the old names people had given each other as reasons to hate tore the world along its seams, enough of them stood up and said, "Not yet. Not today. We carry this forward. We carry each other." And they did, generation after generation, choice after choice, for 11 centuries. And then 11 more, and then more still. Because that is what they do. That is what they are. That is what we are. If this story moved you today, if it reminded you of something you needed to remember, please like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. What does resilience mean to you? What would you build from what has broken you? We want to know. We are listening. We are here, and we are always carrying each other forward. The years that followed the return were not quiet ones. Nothing involving humanity ever stayed quiet for long. The Valthari had returned 17 humans to their world, and expected to retreat into observation once more. They had not expected what came next. Word of the abduction had spread through humanity's unified communication networks within hours of the landing. Not in panic, not in outrage, not in the tribal fracturing that the Valthari's models would have predicted for a species that had just been taken without consent. In curiosity, in something that resembled, to Solvath's instruments, collective pride. As if the species had received news that someone had finally looked closely enough to want to understand them, as if they had been waiting, without knowing it, to be seen. Within 3 days of the return, the Unified Council of Earth had formally transmitted a message to the Valthari vessel still orbiting at the edge of the solar system. The message was not a demand. It was not a legal complaint. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. "You came to study us," the message read. In the precise translated form the Valthari communication matrix produced. "You studied us in the dark, in secret, under conditions of your choosing. We do not blame you. We understand the instinct to observe before engaging. But we are not a species that studies best in isolation. We are a species that reveals itself in contact. Come down." Come down. Sit with us. Let us show you what we actually are. Solvath read the message 4 times. Then she did something that had not been done in 400 years of Valthari field research. She asked her team if they wanted to go. Not as observers, not under protocol, not in the detached, clinical posture of the researcher behind the glass. As guests, every single member of her 37-person research team said yes. If you are still with us on this journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There is more to come, and you will not want to miss it. Share this with someone today. The Valthari landed on Earth for the first time, on a morning in early spring. The site chosen by the Unified Council was the same landing field where the 17 had been returned. It was now a different kind of place. In the week since the return, Humans had come from every corner of the planet to leave things at the edge of that field. Flowers, photographs, handwritten notes in 100 languages. Small objects that meant things only to the people who left them. A child's drawing of a star, a folded piece of cloth, a stone from a riverbed, a seed. They were not leaving these things in grief. They were leaving them in the particular human gesture that means, we were here, and this mattered, and we want you to know. When Salva stepped off the vessel onto the soil of Earth for the first time, her sensory organs registered 10,000 simultaneous inputs. The smell of the ground, the weight of the gravity, slightly heavier than the habitat, the sound of wind moving through the restored trees at the field's edge, the light, the particular quality of a G-type star's light filtered through an oxygen-rich atmosphere, warm in a way that no artificial spectrum had ever quite replicated. And the people, hundreds of them, standing at a respectful distance, silent, not in fear, not in performance. In the particular human silence that is not the absence of speech but the presence of attention, Salvath stood on the soil of Earth and felt something she could not measure. Caro was there. He stepped forward from the crowd with the same easy authority he had shown in the habitat on the first morning. The authority not of rank but of character. He was holding something. He held it out to Salvath. It was a small object. Smooth. Flat. Made of stone. Carved into its surface was the design of the bridge he had scratched into the isolation chamber floor. We make these, he said, when we want someone to know they were part of something that will be remembered. Salvath took it in the limb she had extended for a handshake weeks ago in the habitat. In a moment that now felt like the beginning of a very long story, she held it carefully. She did not have words. She produced them anyway. We owe you more than we can calculate, she said. Caro shook his head gently. You don't owe us anything. You just have to stay long enough to actually meet us. He smiled. We're better in person. What followed was not a diplomatic summit. It was not a negotiation. It was not a formal exchange of cultural data under controlled conditions. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a visit. The Valtheri were taken through cities that had grown over centuries into something between architecture and living systems. Buildings woven through with engineered greenery, waterways restored to courses that had been buried under concrete for hundreds of years. Neighborhoods that had been redesigned over generations. With the specific intention of making strangers feel like they could belong, they were taken to the great memory archives, the vast repositories of human history that the convergent civilization maintained not as museums, but as active, breathing parts of public life. Why do you keep all of this? Travis asked, standing in a gallery that held artifacts from wars, fought 3 centuries before anyone currently alive had been born. The archivist who was guiding them, a young woman with the precise, passionate manner of someone who had dedicated themselves to something they believed mattered, turned to him with an expression of genuine surprise at the question. So we remember what it cost, she said. But it is past. Drevo sighed. The suffering is over. Why maintain the weight of it? She was quiet, for a moment, as if deciding how to explain something she had never needed to explain before because everyone around her already understood it. Because the weight is not a burden, she said finally. It is an anchor. Explain, Trevor said. An anchor keeps you where you need to be, she said. The memory of what we went through, all of it. The wars, the floods, the famines, the moments we almost chose wrong. That memory keeps us here. In this version of ourselves. The version that chose better. C'est possible. If we forget the costs, we forget the choice. And if we forget the choice, we stop making it. Travis stood in the gallery for a long time, after she moved on to answer another question. He stood looking at a child's shoe, 300 years old, preserved behind glass, found in the ruins of a city that no longer existed. He stood there long enough that Salvath came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Share it, because stories about what it means to remember, to carry, to choose these stories, deserve to be heard. On the 4th day of the visit, Salvath asked to meet Esse again. The grandmother had been resting. The return journey had taken more from her than she had shown in the habitat, and the physicians who had examined her upon return had recommended rest with the particular firmness of people who knew she would not take it unless firmly told. She had, apparently, agreed to rest for approximately 4 days before declaring herself recovered. Solvath found her in a garden attached to the home of her extended family. A sprawling, multi-generational household in a coastal city that had been rebuilt twice in living memory and stood, now with the particular solidity of something that knew what it meant to fall and had decided, each time, to stand taller. Issa was sitting in the sun with her eyes half closed, in the posture of someone performing the ancient human practice of simply being warm. She opened her eyes when Solvath approached. She did not look surprised. "I thought you might come," she said. Solvath settled onto a surface beside her, an accommodation made naturally. No discussion needed, both of them simply arranging themselves for conversation the way long acquaintances do. "I have been thinking about what you said," Solvath began. "Which part?" "The children?" "You said every generation looks at the children and thinks, they deserve to see what this becomes." Yes. "I have been trying to understand it as a mechanism," Solvath said, "as a driver of collective behavior, but my models keep failing." Essa tilted her face slightly toward the sun. "Because it isn't a mechanism," she said. "What is it then?" "It is love," Essa said. "And love doesn't fit in a model." Solvath processed this. "You have unified a species of 14 billion people," she said. "You have sustained that unification across 11 centuries of compounding crises. You have built a civilization that does not fracture under pressure, and you are telling me the fundamental engine of all of it is love." "Yes," Essa said, without hesitation. "That seems," Solvath searched for the word, "impossible." Essa offered. "Insufficient," Solvath said. "Love is individual. It is local. How does a local emotion sustain a global civilization?" Essa turned to look at her then, with the full attention of someone who has been waiting patiently for the right question. "You are thinking of love as a feeling," she said. "The feeling is local, yes. But love is not only a feeling." "What else is it?" "A practice," Essa said. "A discipline. A thing you do every day whether or not you feel it. Because you know that the doing of it keeps the feeling possible." "C'est pas safe. We love the children we haven't met yet," she said. "The ones who will walk on Earth 100 years from now. We love them the way you love someone you've heard great things about, not in your chest, not with the heat of it. With your hands, with your choices." She looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. The hands of 83 years. "Every generation loves the next one into existence," she said. "Not romantically, not even personally. We love them the way a craftsperson loves the person who will one day use what they have made. We love them well enough to do good work." Silence settled between them, warm as the sun. Solvath sat with it. She had spent 400 years measuring things. She was beginning to understand that some of the most important things had always been outside her instrument's range. Not because they were small, because they were everywhere. On the 7th day of the visit, something unplanned happened. The Valthari research team had been scheduled to attend a formal cultural exchange, music, art, a demonstration of the craft traditions that had survived the convergence. What they attended instead was a funeral. One of the elders of the city, a man of 101 years who had been among the last generation to remember the final nation-states, had died that morning. The Unified Council sent an apologetic message, offering to reschedule. Solvath replied that they would be honored to attend, if it was permitted. There was a pause of several hours before the response came. It came not from the council, but from the elder's family. Yes, it said simply. He would have wanted to be remembered by the largest possible circle. The funeral was held in the city's central gathering space. Not a temple, not a government building, but a public garden that had been designed. Solvath learned, specifically for occasions of collective feeling. Thousands of people came. They came from every part of the city and several from other cities entirely. People who had known the elder, people who had known of him, people who had simply heard and felt that they should be present. There was music, live, layered, a sound that built slowly from individual voices into something that seemed larger than the sum of its parts. There were words, dozens of people who stood and spoke of this man, not in eulogies constructed for dignity's sake, but in stories, specific and human and sometimes funny, The kind of stories that keep a person alive in the room even after they are no longer in the world. There was silence, deliberate, structured, held collectively with the same quality of attention Salvath had noticed in the crowd at the landing field. And then there was something she had not anticipated. At the end of the ceremony, the family released seeds, hundreds of them, from plants native to the region where the elder had been born, scattered by the hands of his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren into the garden's prepared soil. He always said, his eldest daughter explained, voice steady in the way of someone who has been crying for days and has reached the place beyond crying where something clearer lives, that the best thing a person can do is leave something growing. Salvath watched the seeds fall. She watched them taken by the wind, spreading beyond the garden's edge into the city beyond. She thought about what Essa had said. Love is a practice. Love with your hands. Love for the people you will never meet, she thought. This is what it looks like. This is what 11 centuries of choosing looks like. Right here, right now, in seeds scattered by grieving hands into prepared ground. If this story is speaking to you, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share this because someone in your life needs to hear that grief can become a garden, that loss can become a seed, that even the hardest things can be turned into something that grows. On the 9th day, Salvath sat with Huel, the mathematician, on the roof of a research institute that looked out over a city that moved with the particular rhythm of a place that has been built and rebuilt until it knows its own bones. Huel had gone back to work immediately upon return. He was that kind of person, the kind for whom work and living were not separate categories. He was in the middle of something involving prime number distribution patterns that he claimed had implications for faster-than-light communication theory, which he explained with the enthusiasm of someone who has forgotten that not everyone finds this equally riveting. Salvath found it, in fact, quite riveting. They talked mathematics for 2 hours before Huel set down his instruments and looked at the city below them and said, with the abruptness of someone whose mind moves faster than their conversation, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Salvath said. "When you first took us, when you ran your experiments, what did you expect to find?" Salvath considered. "We expected to find limits," she said. "Every species has them, points beyond which cohesion fails. Suffering exceeds adaptive capacity. Survival instinct overrides social bonds. And instead, we found that your limits appear to move," she said. "Every time we applied sufficient pressure to approach what our models identified as a threshold, the threshold relocated." Huel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "We call it raising the floor," he said. "Explain." "Every generation of humans who survive something terrible raises the floor," he said. "Not by becoming immune to suffering, by becoming more capable of holding it collectively. The floor, the minimum level of endurance, of unity, of willingness to keep going, rises with each generation that practices it." He paused. "My grandmother survived things I have never had to face. She raised the floor. I inherited it. I stand on it." He tapped the roof surface beneath them. "This building was built on foundations laid by people who came before. I don't think about the foundations when I walk through the door, but they hold me up." Salvath was quiet for a moment. "You are describing inherited resilience," she said, "not genetic." "Cultural." "Yes," Huel said. "The most important things we inherit aren't in our genes. They're in our stories, in our practices, in what we teach the children about what we went through and why it was worth surviving." "And if the stories were lost?" Salvath asked. Huel looked at her seriously. "That is the thing we are most afraid of," he said. "Not another flood. Not another fire. The loss of the stories, the forgetting." He looked back at the city. "Which is why we keep them. Why we carve them into buildings and name streets after them and make children learn them, and why the archives exist and why funerals sound the way they do." He paused. "We are, at our core, a story-keeping species. Everything else we do comes from that." Salvath filed this in the section of her mind she had recently reorganized, the section that used to be labeled observations. It was now labeled, in a word she had borrowed from the human language of the Convergence era, wisdom. On the final day of the visit, Salvath requested one last meeting, not with any of the 17. Not with the council. Not with any of the remarkable individuals she had come to know in the weeks of this impossible, unplanned, protocol-shattering experience. She requested a meeting with a school, specifically a class of children between the ages of 7 and 10, in a school in a mid-sized city in the region that had once been called South America, in a place that had been underwater twice in the past 3 centuries, and had been rebuilt both times. The request was granted with a cheerful efficiency that characterized humanity's administration of the unusual. Salvath arrived at the school to find 31 children sitting in a semicircle, vibrating with the specific energy of people who have been told something extraordinary is about to happen and are absolutely prepared for it. Their teacher, a man named Dao Yon, with the patient intensity of someone who has chosen the most important work he could find, introduced. Salvath, with the matter-of-fact warmth of a person who has spent years making the unfamiliar feel approachable. The children looked at Salvath. She looked at them. 7 to 10 years old, born into a unified world. They had never known any different. Inheritors of 11 centuries of choosing. One of them, a girl with serious eyes and the bearing of someone already planning to run things someday, raised her hand immediately. "Did you take the people?" she asked. "Yes," Salvath said. "Why?" "Because we wanted to understand you." "Did you?" Salvath considered the question with the full weight of everything that had happened since she first reviewed the data on a small blue planet in the outer spiral. "We began to," she said. The girl nodded, apparently satisfied with this as an honest answer. Another child, a boy who had been trying to hold his hand up patiently for 30 seconds, got his turn. "What was the most surprising thing?" he asked. Salvath did not hesitate, but the more difficult things became, the more closely you held each other. The boy looked confused, as if this was not surprising at all. "Of course," he said. "That's what you do when things are hard." And there it was. There it was in the voice of a 9-year-old child, born into a world built from centuries of choosing. Of course. That's what you do when things are hard. Not extraordinary. Not heroic. Not the subject of aura analyses. Just, of course. The floor had been raised so many times that the children born on it did not know there had ever been any other floor. They had inherited it so completely that what 11 centuries of struggle had purchased felt to them like simply the nature of things. It felt like just how humans were, which, Salvath realized, sitting in a semicircle of 31 children in a city that had been built and rebuilt on the bones of floods, was exactly the point. This was the final victory of the 11 centuries. Not that it had been achieved, but that it had become invisible, that the extraordinary had become ordinary, that the children no longer needed to choose courage because courage had been made into the floor they stood on. Of course, that's what you do when things are hard. If this moved something in you today, if this story reminded you of the floor beneath your feet, built by everyone who came before you, please like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with everyone you know. Leave a comment below. Tell us, what did those who came before you? What are you building for those who come after? We are listening. We are here. And we are always carrying each other forward. Salvath left Earth on the morning of the 10th day. She stood at the entrance of her vessel and looked back at the landing field one final time. Caro was there. He had come alone, early, before the formal farewell that the council had arranged. He was holding the same kind of stone carving he had given her on the first day. But this one was different. He held it out to her. She took it. The design carved into it was not the bridge. It was a circle, 17 marks inside it. Ebonly, Spas said, and a small symbol in the center that she recognized. After a moment, as the mark the humans used in their memory archives to indicate. "This is where the story continues. We want you to come back," Caro said. "We will," Salvath said. "And next time," he said, with the smile of a man who has earned the right to say exactly what he means. "No experiments." "No experiments," she agreed. She carried the stone onto the vessel. She carried it to her observation chamber. She set it on the surface beside the first one, the bridge, the beginning, and she looked at them together, the beginning of understanding, and the promise of continuation. The vessel rose. Below, the earth turned slowly in the light of its star, green and blue and the white of clouds over an ocean that had risen and fallen and been lived beside and mourned and mapped and sung about and built upon and loved with the full, impossible love of a species that refused to stop. Salvath watched until the planet was a point of light. Then she opened her report. She had written at the end, "I do not know what to do with this." She deleted that line. She wrote instead, "We will return. We will bring others who need to see this. We will tell every civilization we encounter about the species on the third planet of the Yellow Star. Not because they are the strongest, not because they are the most advanced, not because they are perfect or finished or beyond failure, but because in 10,000 civilizations, across 400 years of observation, we have never seen what we saw here. We have never seen a species that takes what breaks it and builds a floor for its children. We have never seen grief turned into gardens. We have never seen suffering transformed, generation by generation, into the ground on which the next generation stands without fear. We have never seen love practiced as a discipline across centuries, aimed at people not yet born. We have never heard a child say, of course, when asked about courage. We have never seen the extraordinary become the floor. This species should not have survived. It survived. It did not merely survive. It became, across 11 centuries of choosing, the kind of civilization that makes the universe a little less cold, a little less silent, a little less like a place where things only end. We will return, and when we do, we will come not as observers. We will come as a species that has been changed by witnessing something it did not believe was possible. We will come, if they will have us, as something we have not been before. We will come as students. She saved the report. She looked out at the stars. Somewhere behind her, 3,400 light years back, and growing more distant with every passing moment, a garden was being tended. 17 trees, roots reaching toward each other underground. Seeds scattered by grieving hands into prepared soil. Children running between the trunks, their laughter rising into the regreened forest, carrying forward into a future that 11 centuries of chosen courage had made possible. The universe is very large, but it is not empty. And it is not cold everywhere. There are places in it where creatures of blood and breath and feeling decided, generation after generation, that the darkness was not the end of the story. There are places where the answer to everything that tried to break them was, not yet. Not today. We carry this forward. There are places where love is a discipline and grief is a garden, and the floor keeps rising and the children are born already standing on the shoulders of everyone who refused to fall. There is a small blue planet in the outer spiral of an unremarkable galaxy. It is not remarkable by the standards of the cosmos. It is not the largest. It is not the oldest. It is not the most powerful. But it is the place where a species learned, across 11 centuries of the hardest kind of practice, to be each other's shelter. And that, in all the cold and silent vastness of everything that exists, is one of the most remarkable things there is. This has been your story. Not a story about heroes. Not a story about perfection. A story about the choice that gets made, again and again, in the dark, by ordinary people who love the children they will never meet enough to do good work. That choice is yours too. It has always been yours. Make Italiano. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of the floor beneath your feet and the children who will one day stand on what you build, please, like this video right now, subscribe to this channel, and ring the notification bell. Share this story with everyone in your life who needs to remember what they are made of. Leave a comment. Tell us what you will build. Tell us what you are carrying forward. We see you. We are with you, and we are always, always carrying each other.